Welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all major platforms. We're broadcasting from the treaty lands of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. I'm Paul Smith, host of Food Farm Talk. Please follow the podcast and our social media accounts. Today you'll hear a discussion on water and food held on World Food Day on October 16, 2003, which was organized by the Arrell Food Institute. Evan Fraser, director of the Institute, moderates a panel of University of Guelph researchers, Tongji Li, Hugh Simpson, and Lawrence Goodridge. They discuss emerging research and insights on best practices, barriers, and opportunities regarding water and food. This took place within a larger World Food Day event arranged by many parties, including the Food and Agriculture Organization, Food Tank, several universities, and agri-food partners.
Hello, my name is Evan Fraser, and I'm director of Arrell Food Institute and a professor of geography here at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. So welcome to you all. Today we're gathering to celebrate World Food Day. We'll be spending the day discussing the importance of two vital systems, food systems and the water that supports them. We're currently streaming to you from the Anita Stewart Memorial Food Lab here once again at the University of Guelph, and we're on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This area is covered by what's called the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which is a pre-colonial agreement that sets the scene for today's discussion. The Dish with One Spoon Covenant reminds us that we all inhabit the same land, and we should use its resources, which is symbolized by the dish, wisely. And we must be collaborative about this as we share the single spoon between all of us. It's a fitting message for us all to remember as we start the conversation about food and water. Over the course of the next hour, we're bringing together three extraordinary researchers, colleagues of mine from the University of Guelph. We're going to discuss emerging insights around best practices, barriers to implementing those best practices, and opportunities to help make our food systems and our water systems healthier and more sustainable. So now, I would truly like to welcome to the stage our panelists. On my far left, your right, Dr. Tongji Li. Tongji is an associate professor in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics, FAIR, here at the University of Guelph. She's also Arrell Family Chair in Behavioral and Experimental Economics and the founding director of the FAIR Laboratory for Experimental and Applied Economics. So, Tongji, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Next to Tongji, we have Hugh Simpson. Hugh Simpson is a principal investigator in the Morwick G360 Groundwater Research Institute, and he's a researcher in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. He's a professional geoscientist and has more than 30 years of experience working at multiple levels of government, provincial and regional and municipal. And most recently, we've dragged Hugh into the academic world where he's focusing on the collaborative management and protection of groundwater resources and private water supplies in both farm and rural settings. So Hugh, so nice of you to join us today.
My pleasure.
On my immediate left, and last but not least, Lawrence Goodridge. Larry is the Young Family Professor of Food Safety here at the University of Guelph, and he directs the University of Guelph's Canada Research Institute for Food Safety. Larry studies foodborne pathogens, and in particular, how we can reduce outbreaks of foodborne diseases. So, Larry, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, first question to you all, and maybe we'll start with Larry and work the way down the row. First of all, I'd like to invite the panelists each to tell us about yourself and your research, and give us a sense of what you think the biggest issues facing water, food, and the planet, and how does your work intersect with water and food. So, Larry, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Evan. So, for me, a major issue facing the planet with respect to food and water is the fact that both food and water, and I note that water is a food. We ingest it, and we certainly cannot make solid food without it. So a major issue is the fact that both water and food transmit infectious diseases, and diarrhea causes approximately 1.7 billion illnesses and 1.6 million deaths each year, and foodborne illnesses account for almost 600 million of those illnesses and 450,000 deaths. So this is a major problem. So I address this issue by conducting environmental surveillance for bacteria, viruses, and parasites that cause food and waterborne disease. And one way to do this is to test wastewater for the presence of these pathogens. And this is a very simple approach that can be done globally, and it provides information in near to real time regarding the presence of these pathogens, and that would allow public health officials to take action to stop the spread of these pathogens through food and therefore limit the diseases that are transmitted through food and water.
So there is a follow-up to you. You've just quoted us some really, really big, scary numbers. Billions of illnesses, millions of deaths globally a year. Can you help put that into any sort of context for us? How does that relate to other things? Or would this be sort of an absolutely top priority in terms of public health? Or where just sort of roughly does this fit in terms of public health priorities? Can you sort of put those numbers into context?
So it's a major cause of of morbidity and mortality worldwide. Those numbers that I shared refer to acute illnesses. And so there are also chronic issues associated with this. So for example, we know among children, and children account for a third of the deaths, of foodborne deaths we see globally due to foodborne disease. We know that multiple and repeated episodes of diarrhea can cause malnutrition and stunting. And so this can lead to lifelong complications. So it's not just the initial illnesses, but also the complications.
Yeah, super good point, and thanks for all the work you're doing. For those of you who are joining us online and maybe don't know the University of Guelph, Larry has also been instrumental in doing all of the regions, or much of the region and the campus's surveillance of COVID using wastewater. So thank you for doing that. We've been using your data daily for many years now. Hugh, let's get you into the conversation and give the floor to you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your work and how it intersects.
Well, I had the pleasure early in my life growing up in a food-growing region as well in Western Canada, the Okanagan, and so even though I didn't live on a farm, I was able to work on farms and later in retail produce. And juxtaposed with that was also water quality issues with large, small lakes and watersheds in the area, and what was known as beaver fever or giardiosis. And so that was something that always stuck in my mind, is this vulnerability of water and it's also its importance for food production. Now, relating to one of the big problems and related to that too, which has become more extreme recently, or is becoming increasingly extreme, are climate change impacts, drought, flood on private water supplies, particularly groundwater-based water supplies. And I believe, talking to Larry earlier, we confirmed this, is that surface water supplies are becoming less reliable. They're also more prone to contamination because they don't have the filtering mechanism that groundwater often does. Although groundwater is not perfect, it is typically more secure. And I'm very interested in working with farmers and other rural residents to make them aware about their water supply, to understand better what information they need and how they would like it provided. We've been noticing, obviously, that the rural population has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years, with farmers that were around at that time retiring, their children taking over. Also people coming into the rural community that are new to Canada or new to farming. And they have no knowledge about how to really take care of their private water supply. And so that's something that I'm researching right now in conjunction with colleagues at the Morwick Groundwater Research Institute and also in the Ontario Veterinary College, who have some specialty in community health. And then finally, one colleague who has an insight into the Indigenous community, and they've been largely overlooked as well, so they're really a group that needs a lot of support to help them move forward to secure their water supplies. And so the big issues for me, to restate, are extreme weather events, but also the importance of local food production, because with the pressure on surface water supplies and increased interest in local food production, we're going to see greater demand for groundwater, and we need to make sure that resource is sustainable going forward.
So you mentioned beaver fever, giardia, which as a canoe tripper and someone who's led a lot of scout and cub trips, that's always something that we're trying to avoid. I think a lot of Canadians would only experience problems of water safety and water issues through camping, and so it's sort of a remote issue for most Canadians. Can you maybe again take us up to a global level? You say you're working to help communicate these issues to farmers in different parts of the world. How's it going in terms of talking to farmers about this issue in Canada and then more broadly?
Well, I'll talk a little bit more about the research I'm doing. I've been very involved in a program for most of my professional life called the Environmental Farm Program, which is a risk assessment and risk management tool that farmers can do. It's a series of worksheets that help them rate their property and then come up with measures they can take to reduce the risk. And that's been spread across Canada from Ontario. It started in the early 1990s and has also been emulated in other parts of the world. And so one of the projects I'll talk about also is a reproduction of the Waterborne BMP book, which was done 20 years ago. And we've got a partnership with the Groundwater Project, which is housed at the University of Guelph through my former master's supervisor, Dr. John Cherry. And a revised version of this updated to current technology, as well as to make it more accessible to people, will be translated into as many as 161 languages and be made available internationally for no charge to people to have as a resource.
Yeah, that's awesome, Hugh, and we'll dig into that in a few minutes. First, Tungzi, let's bring you into the conversation. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about your research. You've been doing some fascinating stuff for as long as I've known you. So, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. So I am an experimental and behavioral economist. I study human decision making in an evidence-based way, and within that framework, I study consumption, production, corporation, voting, etc., and etc. So when it comes to food and water, I'm not sure if this is the biggest issue in my mind, but the most interesting, certainly to me, and an important issue is human decision making in our economy. Right. So back to my research, I have some recent experiments looking at people's decision making when it comes to using recycled water in agricultural irrigation. So from scientists' point of view, recycled water is this technology and amazing practice that should be readily adopted, right? After all water in nature is recycled, and recycled water actually faces like higher degree of regulation, so they may be safer than conventional water. And this is really, really going to help us a lot when we have accessibility issues of water in drought areas and so forth. But soon after the development of those kind of technologies, we see numerous media reports talking about toilets to tap, and then with vivid pictures of toilets to tap and people drinking it. So that caused a huge icky effect among the general public, consumers, and even some producers. And if you think about all of this, right, why did it happen? Why did this happen in the first place? And since now it happened, how do you mitigate those ick factors? So those are the biggest issues in my experiments of that sort.
So as a follow-up to you, Tungzi, and then Leah and Hugh, if you want to ask questions of each other, by all means, we can make this free-flowing. But as a follow-up to Tungzi, okay, so we're talking about a big set of problems on the horizon in terms of changing water resources and people's willingness to change their behavior to adapt to those. So given your research, are you sort of optimistic that the communities that you're working in have the, quote, capacity to adapt to the kinds of changes that are coming? Or are we trying to adapt to something that is well beyond our ability to feasibly find adaptations for?
So I don't have a very, very clear answer to that. Reason being, there are two things, right? One is we see human decision-making constantly violates our understanding through the traditional economic decision-making assumptions of the neoclassical economics. However, on the bright side, all of those behaviors, if you dig deeper, they're really going to follow a lot of patterns. And there are a lot of actionable items that practitioners and policymakers can adopt to actually address some of the biases in people's behavior. So, well, are we going to be able to adapt? I think sure, if we all collaborate and understand this more and more.
Hugh and Larry, do you want to jump in on that big question of given the changes that we're seeing in water resources and the stresses on them and our tools that we have to adapt? I mean, Larry, do you want to jump in and say, do you think we have the capacity to adapt to the kinds of changes that we're starting to see? And we'll come back to this question a few times because I think this is actually one of the questions that underpins all of our work. Do we have the capacity to adapt to change? Larry, do you want to invite you to jump in?
So I think we do have the capacity to change. We certainly have the technological possibilities to do that. What I want to focus on, though, is that I think there needs to be a real change in the way of thinking, and primarily in high-income countries, because food and waterborne issues, I think, are still largely seen as something that affect primarily low and middle-income countries. You had mentioned that, when going camping, that is likely the only time, or one of the only times, that people in Canada might think about water safety. And yet, I note that one of the largest outbreaks of waterborne disease due to E. coli happened in this country, in Walkerton, Ontario, approximately 25 years ago. So, and we also know that our Indigenous peoples still struggle to have access to clean and pure drinking water. So I really think there needs to be a shift in thinking in high-income countries, and an understanding that this is a global problem, and it will take global solutions to solve this.
Nice. So we've got collaboration, global thinking, and global solutions. Hugh, do you want to jump in on this point?
I was just thinking, what Tom's saying reminds me of something I proposed when I was a regional hydrogeologist at a regional municipality to the west of here, which I won't name. And I was responsible for what was going on in the rural setting. And we were seeing a lot of well interference complaints with private wells from the very large municipal water taking wells, thousands of gallons per minute. And I'd been reading about Israel in water-scarce areas like that, where they had already started to recycle water, either indirectly or indirectly. And I thought this was a great idea, so I made the sales pitch to my commissioner, and it was crickets. There was no interest. No interest, because the thought, the yuck factor. And yet third pipe in home would be an ideal way of keeping that water in the cycle and not having to go to new waters.
Okay.
And could save money on treatment and disposal, which are very high. But yeah, I think it's that willingness to change. Change seems to be a big obstacle for large organizations, I think.
Yeah, I think we're all working in a context where we desperately want the world to change and be more adaptive, and are constantly scared and frustrated that sometimes our institutions seem to put brakes on change. Hugh, let's stick with you for a minute. What are, in your field, some of the new exciting developments that are getting you, full of energy when you get up in the morning?
Well, I'm a geographer, so I have
really
broad views, and I was initially very technical in my studies, and did hydrogeology as a master's, and planning at the same time. But as I started to look into the topic of groundwater management, I realized it was much less technical a problem than a behavioral one.
Yeah.
And the thing that excites me is this growing use of collaborative community-based management approaches. And I'm involved with a project now to do transdisciplinary, which is where you, as a research team, work with the community you're going to be working with, not to study them, but to involve them in a study of something that's of a worry to them. And private water wells, say with First Nations and farms and other rural residents, is something that's very much a problem in many cases, particularly during times of extreme weather, because their wells can become contaminated, or more likely they're going to be affected by drought, particularly shallow wells, which don't have a lot of freeboard, if you will, in the well to deal with.
So what you have to define freeboard. I don't know that word.
Well, that's the depth of water. I'm using a nautical term, but the standing water in the well that's available to use in the home. And so it's important to work with communities using an approach like this to find solutions that make sense of them. They may be the very same as you'd find with a technical approach, but it's the language that's used, it's the way it's presented, and are the people's interests, values, and beliefs represented in that information. So it's that collaborative approach that excites me. And we have a project to do that, 3 years, and to study the redoing of this book, which is developed with farmers. Let's say the farming community has evolved since then, from a planning and from a veterinary medicine point of view, as well as the engineering point of view. And very excited working with a very diverse community groups, a series of groups. And we're going to work with organizations rather than individual communities, because we feel they would have a better overview of what the communities want and need, and are able to best express that in a timely manner. That's the big thing, is people just don't have time. There's so many draws, particularly I've heard on First Nations communities get involved in research. We're trying to make this as effective and efficient as possible in that way.
Nice. I'm hearing lots of language like collaborative, transdisciplinary, global, community-based, pulling out the keywords out of this conversation. Tamsi, why don't you jump in, and what gets you excited when you get up in the morning about your work?
Let me give you an example of my current findings. Okay, so a couple of years back, I brought my research team and went to a wine festival, and we did an experimental auction with a bunch of people. What we wanted to know is what are people's bidding behavior when the wine was produced with grapes irrigated with recycled water or with conventional water. So we set it up and we asked people to bid on 3 different products: recycled, conventional, and unspecified, meaning that it can be 50% chances of either recycled or conventional. So what we found was our participants bid higher when it comes to conventional water compared to the recycled water. But most strikingly, the highest bid came from the unspecified. Isn't that really interesting? This violates our economic thinking, right? If there's uncertainty, it's either A or B, and you have different preferences for A and B, the unspecified should lie in the middle. But people actually bet significantly higher when it was unspecified. And then we actually dug a little deeper with multiple replications in different settings, and we all replicate that sometimes consumers do not want to know. So if you think about this, there's this thinking, we should incentivize people, we should outreach to people, we should provide more information, and there's something behavioral there. So without evidence-based decision-making behavioral studies, how do you know that people actually prefer not to know?
All right, so one of the things I love about working with you, Tongzi, is the embracing and commitment to collecting data to understand these things. I'm more of a qualitative social scientist, so we come at the world using different methods. Do you have any more qualitative insights as to why that would be? What's going on in a person's brain, psychology, their sociology? Are there qualitative things that might be going on that allow a person to say, or lead a person to say, I would pay more for something I don't know about?
So, I can't change my field of study. I'm a quantitative economist, but at the same time, I think we can actually extrapolate some of my evidence into some of the quantitative insights. So, summarizing all of my experiments so far, I think a lot of the times it's when people have competing thoughts in their head, right? So if I opt for recycled water, there's that ick factor or yuck factor, right? I really do not want to think that I'm drinking sewage water when I'm drinking
that's
water.
fair.
That's fair, right? But then on the other hand, I also do not want to admit that I prefer conventional water. That makes me a bad person. Especially when we talk about, there's California where Napa Valley is located, and, recycled water can help with a lot of things. Conventional water, on the other hand, is still going to, do bad to the environment. I do not want to drink recycled water. I do not want to think that I prefer conventional water, so I prefer not to know. When it's unspecified, yeah, sure.
That is a great answer. I love that. I'm going to think about that. Larry, let's get on to you. What in the field of research you're working on, what are you most excited about these days?
So I'm excited about the possibility of some of the more recent technological advances that could be employed to improve primarily water safety, because a major source of contamination of food is the water used to produce that food. And so, for example, these include advancements in sanitation, so development of more efficient toilets and effective toilets that could be used in low resource settings. Also, developments in wastewater treatment facilities, which are urgently needed in both urban and rural areas. And again, as I said earlier, this is not just an issue in low and middle income countries. We know in Canada, for example, we're seeing increasing issues with sewage overflows from water treatment plants due to extreme rainfall events. And so, and we have aging infrastructure, so we need these improvements, these technological advancements to solve that. The tools, very simple tools that can be used to test foods in resource limited settings to ensure that they're safe, so that people do not consume them. And then lastly, food preservation systems. So most of the foodborne illnesses that occur globally are due to fruits and vegetables, and that's because we don't cook them. We tend to consume them raw. And so we really need to take advantage of some of the recent advancements in food preservation to develop sustainable approaches that can be used, particularly in places with limited access to electricity, that could be used to improve the safety of these foods that we consume raw.
All right, so Larry, I'm really glad you've mentioned technology, because I feel quite strongly that novel technologies linked with robotics and AI and genomics and 3D printing, and I know your lab uses a lot of 3D printing, these technologies give us new ways of producing food and processing food, packaging food, and that some of the problems we're facing as a global society can be addressed through technology. So, but then there's always this behavioral question that Tungzi and Hugh are talking about, which is sort of better communication and global mindset and collaboration. Can you just sort of step back from the specifics and reflect on technology versus human behavior, and where in the world you're working in the sort of the right wins are, where the wins exist?
Yeah, and that's a wonderful point. And Hugh, I think you really frame this discussion on this aspect. So with respect to human behavior, as we know, we may have all the technological advancements in the world, but if people do not accept or utilize those, then we will still have the problems that we have. And so in my work, I try to focus on education of the human population with respect to the problems that we face with respect to food and water contamination. And we're talking about it today, but it's important to understand that for many people in the world, it may not be obvious that food and water can become contaminated and are a source of disease. So education around that is imperative. We can use and do use social media platforms to do that, although I note that a potential challenge to that is the rise of disinformation.
Yeah.
And so moving forward, that is something that will have to be addressed. I think I also spend time educating those in government agencies and those who can affect policy change with respect to the need for globalized sharing of data. We don't share data very well as a population. And I think that is some very low-hanging fruit that can really help us begin to address this problem.
Hugh, why don't you jump in here? I mean, you're sort of an expert on public communication. Larry, I know, gives a lot of his time to public communication. Well, what have you learned about the best practices in terms of communicating with, you working largely with farm and rural communities, but that or more generally?
Well, there's two sides to that question. I was trained in government how not to answer a question. Of course, actually, apparently I was quite good at that because I got some high-level training on that. But I think the best thing to do is often just sitting down and meeting with people.
Yeah.
And I did mention this environmental farm plan program. It's a 2-day workshop format where people come together as a community. They're fed, which is usually often important. There needs to be some kind of immediate return, and food is often a good one. But they work through their property, and they develop an understanding of what's basically a risk on their property. And it may not be environmental, it may not even be health, it might even be something that's financially based. And then they come up with a series of what are known as best management practices. These are things that are, they can be implemented, they're economically feasible, and they're also going to work with the operation that they've got. And it can apply, there was a version of it done by Wayne Caldwell a few years ago in Cedric, School of Environmental Design and Rural Development, with a colleague at Huron County Health, where they took the model and they expanded it to cottages and to rural residents. But it's just a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And they don't know that their septic system can contaminate their well. And they may not know that running a water softener or a hot tub into your septic system is maybe not the best choice because it can damage it or destroy it. So it's really just giving them information in a neutral way, but taking the time to do that. And talking at people is probably not as effective as talking with them. I think it's important to have these sort of discussions and forums where they can come forward with their questions and not feel like they're asking stupid questions. There are no stupid questions, because if you don't know, you don't know. but giving them that chance to express their concerns and to learn something and then work through how it applies to them. I think now people are bombarded, particularly with social media in the last few years, with so much information. And
disinformation, to Larry's point.
Disinformation too, and I saw something about instead of using traditional atmospheric water, which is water that comes through the hydrologic cycle, you should be drilling to get water that's created by magmatic processes, so volcanoes. And I thought, well, that's insane, because that water usually has what's not suitable for drinking, and you would not be able to access it with normal drinking. But that doesn't matter. It's just some way of discrediting what is a normal system, because it's that whole doubt and question around government and technology. Fascinating but bizarre stuff. So it's that developing that relationship. I think it comes down to relationship and trust, and that's why I've often worked with organizations who understand what the concerns are of their organizations and have a level of trust already, and they can be almost opening doors for you to talk to people directly or indirectly about changes that they can make.
Cool. Tungzi, is there anything in the huge data sets that you've collected on the bidding experiments and other experiments or social experiments you've done with farm groups about how much people will pay for certain things? Is there anything that you can glean from that data about best ways of communicating or key messages that might land better?
Mm-hmm. So, well, first of all, I think every single good research field evolves, right? And I'm really glad to hear that from everybody, actually, now that people are paying attention to the behavioral side. As behavioral economists, we now pay more attention to evidence-based, data, essentially. So, so to your question, Evan, I think a lot of it is actually context dependent, right? So, yes, I have a lot of evidence, and one example is at the Canada's Outdoor Farm Show in the past 2 years. What we found was people bid on the same product significantly lower when exactly the same messages were delivered by scientists compared to any other messenger, including NGOs, government, fellow farmers, and private company even. So, is that context dependent? Is that only going to be found among farmers?
So let's just reinforce that point in case people missed it, because I think it's a fascinating one. People are less responsive or less interested in messages delivered by scientists. If that message comes in the same message comes from a different source, it has greater credibility. Is that am I interpreting you right?
Yes, not just about credibility, right? This is measured behavior. This is revealed behavior. I don't know if people don't trust scientists or they're just having this negative responses to scientists. And then the baseline is a little bit different, right? It's not that people are less responsive to scientists. It's that they're more responsive to scientists in a negative way.
They're more responsive in a negative way. So you're using some complicated language there. That sounds like less responsive to scientists to me.
But compared to a baseline where you do not deliver any kind of message, people bid significantly lower when scientists deliver a message. So, sorry about that.
Thanks for unpacking that. So what is a group of scientists, what is society supposed to can do with that information?
I think, I actually went back to the farm show a year later, and I tested whether or not it's the messenger's identity, mere identity, or is the way that we talk to people. And the finding is it's just that one word, scientists. And I think what scientists can do is to collaborate more with other people, because all the messages I tested came from scientists. It's just like wearing a different hat. And if you think about this, there are scientists in NGOs, there are scientists who are university researchers, but then just wearing a different hat changed people's, farmers in this case, changed their behavior in a positive way. So again, collaborate, I guess.
Yeah, speaking as someone who's devoted 25 years to being a scientist, I find this hard message to swallow, but in the interests of making a positive impact on the world, we have to be paying attention to this sort of data. So thanks for bringing that up. Thanks for unpacking it for us. Let's jump over to you. Each of us on this panel in the world, we all bring different perspectives to these issues, and we're talking about water use in food and agriculture today. So what do you think the biggest barriers to creating a more sustainable, and you can choose how you define sustainable, more sustainable water use and food systems approach? What are the barriers?
So I think there are some significant barriers. The first one is climate change. We are on a planet with changing weather patterns, extreme rainfall events, droughts, and so forth, and this can obviously impact the availability of water and clean water. The second thing is equitable access to water. So, in some regions of the world, small-scale farmers, and I do place an emphasis on women, just do not have access to water and or to clean water, and that can obviously impact food and contamination and so forth. And then the other thing is, which we've touched on several times before, the other two things are water scarcity and water pollution. So scarcity, the increasing reliance on surface waters, which can become contaminated due to climate change and other factors, as well as pollution, that is, and I'm specifically referring to contamination with microorganisms that can cause human disease. That has been a problem globally in many regions of the world, particularly the global south for years, we know that, but as I said earlier, this is also a problem in places like Canada, the United States, and certainly as climate change opens up other regions, such as northern regions like the Arctic, we have to be cognizant of contamination of those sources as well.
So in your answer, you talked about scarcity and equity as kind of key themes, and then quality as well. Can we go back to the technology versus society kind of question? I mean, if you say water is scarce, I immediately think we could develop technologies that would reduce scarcity, desalination plants or better filtration systems, things like that. But then equity issues, indigenous communities that don't have access to fresh water that you referred to earlier, the challenge that largely women-led small farmers in the global south face in terms of access, those are less likely perhaps to be assessed or addressed by technology. Can you help us unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so one other thing I didn't mention was inefficient water use. So the first thing I think, and this comes back to my earlier point about we have to, the solutions to these problems have to be global. So we have to, instead of thinking about this is the water we have in Canada, the Great Lakes, the largest source of fresh water in the world. Well, yep. We think about that as a largely Canadian resource, or maybe a Canadian and American resource. We really need to start thinking about that as a global resource, and so we need to share the water. So first of all, let's rely on technology and use technology to reduce the overuse of water, the wastage of water, if you will, and then can we start to share that resource as a global resource? So that's the first thing. Yeah. With respect to the second aspect, which is equitable access. Technology can play a part, but ultimately that's a behavioral issue. And I think that's where education comes in, and that's where constantly sharing messages that would affect the behavioral change can come in. I'm saddened to hear about the fact that scientists are not viewed as reputable sources of information. But I think that notwithstanding, we have to come up with effective ways. I do think social media is a great potential way, or other internet approaches are a great potential way to do this. We know, for example, that even in low resource settings, the majority of people on this planet have a cell phone.
Yep.
So it's a very simple way and sustainable way to share these messages.
Hugh, do you want to jump in on the barriers question? What do you think the barriers are to sustainable water use in farming?
To me, the climate change and extreme events is a big one, but it's compounded by this movement towards urbanization of countries across the world. This is one that I think Canada has already gone through 100 years ago, where we saw the rural population shifting from being the majority of the residents to the urban becoming the large, and now I think 2% of the population or less produces food for the majority of Canada, and also for export. I understand in other countries internationally, they're seeing this movement of people from the countrysides, rural areas, to large these mega cities, which creates demands for water and for food. The trouble is these mega cities grow out onto the prime agricultural lands, displacing food production, but also putting unsustainable demands on water, particularly groundwater, to sustain that food production. And then combined with that are the increasingly frequent and extreme events like flooding and droughts. And it's also you just don't know when they're going to come. I know earlier this year we had looking pretty dire in the early part of the corn growing season. People were concerned, but it was made up for a little bit later, and they managed to have really good results. But a year ago, I remember there were some producers to the west of here who were talking about moving away from rain-fed production, relying on it to be thinking about irrigation.
Wow.
And that's going to put increasing demand on our groundwater resources because they can't depend on precipitation at the peak time when they need that water. And that's going to be, and for me, the equity piece is the cost. For a large producer, that's one thing, but for a small farmer, perhaps in the global south, who doesn't have the funds to put in an irrigation system, that could be devastating for them because the cost is just unsustainable. And again, to me, that replacement with rain-fed crop production with irrigation could be a game changer for many farmers. Because as you know, farmers, I'm not an economist, so I apologize, I understand cannot pass on the costs of their crops to society. They're cost takers, is that the term?
Price takers.
So they really don't control that. So we see that more and more with these large value chain situations where the farmers are expected to absorb cost increases and the retailers and other people in that chain do not. So I think it's climate change that's a big one for me, and that inequity that can result.
Nice. I have a question to follow up with you, Hugh, but I'm going to say that I want to bring Tungzi back in. What do you think about barriers there, Tungzi?
So, well, first of all, I think the biggest barriers always come with the biggest opportunities as well. So I wanted to say, to me, obviously, the biggest barriers are behavioral barriers. But I see this from a very, very different angle, maybe perhaps compared to a lot of people. So first of all, when it comes to behavioral changes, well, we're not assuming that as long as a technology is beneficial, people are going to adopt it. But now more and more social scientists become aware that this is not the case, which brings us hope. Because now that we know this is not automatically going to work, then we're really spending some time and resources and knowledge to try to address it. And we're not being wishy-washy in terms of, let's just assume we know what's going to happen. Now we're saying, let's go and collect some behavioral data and see how people respond to different kinds of education, different kinds of information, so on and so forth. And if you think about this, if we can change consumer behavior, for example, if consumers are more favorable towards equitable, production system and sustainability, then it will increase the demand. And although producers are most times price takers, they will see that premium. So again, to me, I do see there are a lot of opportunities that come with the barriers, which again is behavioral, but I'm really hopeful. So.
That's great. Okay, a follow-up question to all three of you, and I'll let you ponder who wants to jump in first. Last week, a number of us were in Toronto, and we participated in the launch of a new organization called the Canadian Alliance for Net Zero Agriculture. That's a collaboration, so that word again, collaboration between some very large corporate players, some producer groups, some really great non-governmental organizations, and we're very excited about creating sort of an incentive structure or set of programs that will lead to reductions in climate change. Emissions out of our agricultural sector. I had an interesting conversation with a producer last week who farms about 30,000 acres of land in Saskatchewan. And they've had a very, very dry summer. So this is the link to the water conversation. And I asked this producer, his name's Christian Herbert, and I said, how was your summer this year? Because it was really dry in the part of the country you were at. And he said, well, Evan, he said it was better than I expected. It wasn't great, but it was way better than I expected for two reasons. And this is where I want you to get you to reflect on. One, we had a pretty good amount of rainfall last fall, so it filled the soil up with water. And second, I've been investing in conservation tillage practices which have allowed the soil to build up with organic matter. And organic matter is important because it acts like a sponge. It holds on to that water. So he was able to build up his adaptive capacity, perhaps, or his ability to be resilient to drought by over the last 10 years, building up his soil's organic matter. So for me, there's a whole bunch that's important to go on here. So maybe in no particular order. Hugh, what are the sort of communication best management practices lessons that we need to extract and make more widespread? Tungzi, how do we create an economic system? Larry, what do you think about the basic hydrology that's going on here in this little anecdote I've told you about? Because I think for us, it's a really important metaphor, or not a metaphor, it's a really important example that we need to sort of make much more widespread. And so I just open it to the three of you. One of you just want to jump in and provide a reaction to that story? Tungzi, it looks like your hand is flickering under the...
No, I was just wondering if we should go...
you start. Give us a start.
I'll start. I think one research question that I'm particularly interested in is how do you change behavior towards the good, and how do you sustain that behavioral change? So a lot of the times I've been thinking, I farm, and this year, if there's extreme weather event, I may adapt. But then the next year, am I going to still use the practice that I've learned this year during those extreme weather events? And then is there any way that policymakers and practitioners, so on and so forth, can actually anchor it in people's mind? This worked in that particular year. Do you have the incentive, or do you have the habit to keep using that going forward? So I think that's an interesting research question, and I'm not aware of any evidence-based research in that area. So
good. Hugh, do you want to jump in?
I'm just going to say that ties in nicely to the sort of things I'm interested in, which is to talk to community organizations that understand farmers, rural residents, and First Nations communities about what are the things they're concerned about. And they're concerned about a lack of water or runoff. And I know no-till integration is a great way of reducing runoff. It builds up the soil there, and that seems to be a big push of this movement, broader movement towards soil health. And it creates a sponge-like absorbent capacity of the soils as opposed to the older, more mineral soils where they've lost the organic. And that's been the concern, is that the old, strictly profit-driven motives, instead of returning material to the soil and leaving the residue on, broken down and returns the organic matter, is a great way. So it's just of doing that, but it's this, what are your concerns and how do we help you resolve those concerns? Say with the lack of trust to scientists, finding an intermediary, if you will, or a bridge organization that can help share that information and maybe invite people in, like Larry or Tungzi or even myself, to talk. You're likely to get less likely to get tarred and feathered in the process if you say something that's maybe uncomfortable, but they're more likely to listen to you and maybe take some of that away with them. But I think it's that developing, again, back to the relationship. And we've lost that sort of extension model that used to exist. I know the University of Guelph had an amazing history, really world history of 150 more years ago, where farmers, researchers, and government worked together to solve problems that suited the Ontario climate and improve agriculture here. And it's become a little more reductionist kind of approach. And I think going back to the more holistic approach, bringing the science to bear through the community groups and working with the farmer organizations would probably be very helpful.
Larry, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah. So listening to both of those answers, for me, the first thing I take is, and to follow up on what you've just said, and also this issue of scientists and not being trusted, is relationship building. Yeah. So we have gotten away from forming relationships with those who produce food, and I think those have to be rebuilt. And because rebuilding those relationships should ideally then lead to trust, which you said how the University of Guelph used to do this. Certainly in the United States, they have a very well-developed extension program between universities and food producers, and that has really helped, I think, to spread science. Because science, to me, is a major way to solve this problem. So you mentioned the farmer in Saskatchewan, using scientifically researched and validated principles to retain water in the soil. So there's a wealth of that knowledge out there already. We don't have to develop new technology, it's already there. How do we put that information into the hands of those who produce food in a way that they will trust what we're saying? On the other hand, so water retention is needed in some areas. On the other hand, there are places where there's too much water because of flooding and extreme events. So, what can we do to solve that? So, I think for me, it begins with rebuilding those relationships, taking advantage of the enormous use of the enormous wealth of research, global research that already exists that could be used to begin solving these problems. Things like pest management for crops and so forth, which are becoming increasingly important as the climate changes. And then by rebuilding those relationships, developing that trust so that the information provided will be acted upon.
Great. All right, last question, or depending on how quickly you answer the second last question as we run the clock down on this discussion, where do you think the right leverage or intervention points are? Like, where does change start from? Are we needing to communicate directly with farmers, or is this a job for communicating more with banks to get financial incentives organized in a different way? I'd like to sense your sense of priorities as to who you think we should be targeting with these sort of communication messages. Perhaps not scientists, but you can make that determination yourself. Hugh, can we start with you on that one?
Yeah, I think going back to, be repetitive, I think education is an important one, and I brought a prop, of course. It's always good to have a prop. Is just encouraging people to sample their water supply. And this is available locally through the public health units. Many jurisdictions have them through the public health units where they take a sample, ideally 3 or more times a year, to just find out what the basic water quality is in that in terms of indicator bacteria. Is their well secure? Is their private water secure? Well, some people probably do it for cottage surface water supplies, but I'm pretty sure there you're going to get guaranteed you're going to get something in there you don't want to drink. But that to me would be the first line of action, is just getting people to test their water supply. And Larry mentioned the Walkerton tragedy a number of years ago. The water supply testing went up exponentially for about a year after that, and then it's dropped back down. This was complacency. People didn't see a problem with their water supply, but there are a lot of people out there who we know from the science are drinking water that they probably shouldn't be drinking. And there's some simple things they could do to secure their water supply so they're not at risk. The thing, I think, another second thing, and this is from working in government and also working in academia, recently is the recognition in government policy in the different levels, federal, provincial, municipal, that water is a shared resource. It doesn't belong to the municipality, it doesn't belong to the province, it belongs to the people. And that local food production is a priority use, and it's going to become an increasingly prioritized use as global food chains maybe have problems with climate change interruptions. We remember the $12 cauliflower a year or two ago are not able to get from Maine. Your household, I know that was a crisis in our home because that's what we fed our guinea pigs, so we couldn't get from Maine. There were problems.
Who will think of the guinea pigs?
Yeah, who will think of the guinea pigs? So that should be something there too, and maybe above things like recreational uses, swimming pools, or aesthetic uses. Like I had a neighbor who used to wash his sidewalk off once a week, which drove me crazy. But it looked better apparently. I just didn't understand the rationale. And then also, this is more of a pragmatic approach in empowering public health to get involved again. I think they've been under a lot of stress with the pandemic. I'm not sure how the public views public health anymore. I know there were some people who took issue with the restrictions put on their actions during the pandemic. But there's cases where, and also empowering landowners, well owners, to actually get involved with their own well. There are some regulations in this province that prohibit a person from opening their own well without doing certain things. And it should really be encouraged to open the well, look at the well, see if there's leakage in the well casing, to measure their water level to see how much water they've got in their well. It's just like any other piece of infrastructure, and you need to maintain it, you need to understand it. If you ran your car for 20 years without looking under the hood, or having somebody else do that, you would have probably a car that didn't work. And it's the same thing with wells. I had a phone call once, I'll close with this, from a rural resident who said, "You've shut off my water." And I said, "Well, where are you located?" I was working as a regional hydrogeologist And he said, well, they were out in an area. And I said, well, you're outside of our service envelope, so the municipality does not provide you with water, so you probably have a well. I don't have a well. You should check in your basement, your garage, look under your porch. It turned out it was in there under the porch. I said, you are your own water supply commissioner. You have to know where your well is and what state it's in. But there are a lot of people, and particularly with this exodus from urban areas under the pandemic, when people were able to work from home, there probably are many people out there that don't know they have their own private water system and wastewater system that they probably need to look at and become aware of where it is and how it's functioning.
Great. Yeah. Well, words of wisdom there, Hugh. Thank you for that. Tungzi, where do you think the intervention points are?
Well, I know you probably know part of my answer, collaboration. I really cannot identify the single most important entity to this. And I think our society is more heterogeneous than ever, right?
Yeah.
People are so different. And now with the political polarization, we don't know if one information, like one message, will backfire or really work. And we also don't know, so you talk about education, but then who do we educate? We create those kind of trust and networks and so forth. Are we really being inclusive, and are people actually outside of our group being excluded from our education system and relationship building? So I think I'll just conclude by saying, water and food are an essential, thing to everybody. So everybody may have an opinion about it. But let's not assume that everybody thinks alike. And not just because I believe this type of message or this type of intervention will work, then I can assume that it will actually work in the world with all the populations. So trust scientists and evidence-based scientific research is probably one type of intervention that we can implement. How do you implement that? Again, come back to the evidence-based social science research, yes, and collaborate.
Words of wisdom from you too. Thanks, Tungzi. Larry?
Yeah, for me, it has to be at the level of the individual. If there's anything that we've learned, certainly during this pandemic, it's that one cannot legislate change. So we can have all the government regulations one wants, but if people are not willing to do that, it just won't happen. And so I think it's important to begin at the individual, but also make it relevant to them by explaining how what is being communicated can actually help them. I think that's been the missing point here. If they truly understand that what is being communicated will help them in their endeavors producing food or not getting sick from drinking well water or whatever the case may be, I think they're more likely to listen. But I also think that we have to really have a focus on educating the next generation. So that would be children. At elementary school, starting at the elementary school level, actually. That's been something that has that we've moved away from as well. And so we find that children have no idea about how their food is produced, or why water conservation is important, and how climate change affects all of that. And I think they are the future food producers. So educating them and starting right at the elementary school level should be a long-term approach that hopefully will begin to have them develop further trust in scientists and the technologies that are being developed.
Super great. Thank you for that. I've been taking careful notes, or sketchy careful notes, as we've been going along, and I'm a community-based, collaborative, sharing data, ensuring equity, building relationships, all so that we can marshal the technological and management solutions and bring those solutions to bear on this problem of how to conserve water, maintain ecosystem services across the entire planet, and achieve food security for all. And, not to belabor the point, one of the things that I've done, Tungzi, in the past as a researcher and a scientist and developing evidence around is to look at how societies in the past have adapted to big environmental crises. And I say with some degree of confidence that it's exactly those things that allow a society to move through a period of great turbulence. And by contrast, when bad things happen, when things fall apart, it's because we don't collaborate, we don't share, we don't have the relationships of trust that allow us to bring the technologies and the management practices to bear. So I'm filled with hope by everything that you folks have said. So it has been an honor and a privilege to be able to facilitate this panel as part of the official North American programming for World Food Day. So thank you to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, to Food Tank, to Driscoll's, the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Land and Food Systems, to Simon Fraser University, to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, to Compass Group, and a huge thank you to my friends and colleagues here at the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph, who did the logistics in the background. Thank you to Tungzi and Hugh and very great colleagues here from an interdisciplinary perspective at the University of Guelph.
Thanks for tuning in to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph or via podcast on all major platforms. And thanks to the Arrell Food Institute for permission to broadcast this panel discussion. Please join us again next time for another episode of Food Farm Talk.